And we are recording. So hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's session for the Old Sword Club, part of our sort of, COVID lockdown weekly sword chats, lessons, seminars, workshops. I don't know what to call them, but this one is on dueling. So more specifically about kind of just general stuff about dueling practices in the late 18th and into 19th century. I sort of started researching this and I realized that a lot of what I wanted to look at in terms of dueling culture actually started in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. So this is going to be part historical discussion. I'm going to talk about a bit about the history behind dueling, particularly from a cultural perspective. Part practical demonstration. I've got swords just nearby, hands, arm's length. If I need to demonstrate anything. But also a big part of it's going to be a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, feel free to jump in with a question. Alternatively, just throw them in the chat. I think I've already got one question in the chat. In fact, definitely have one question in the chat. Where someone wants to know, what weapons do I consider to be my specialty? So my primary focus is late 19th century British sabre. It often gets called British military sabre, but the problem is that there's no other type of sabre in the period. And I think calling it military sabre or dueling sabre or something like that is more a way of distinguishing it from a modern Olympic sabre, which is just a 20th century sabre design. But yeah, so my primary specialty is 19th century sabre. And then from there, I also do épée and bowie knife as kind of my core, those three are kind of my core weapons. And I also do walking stick, bayonet. I do a bit of boxing, kind of as the things that I feel comfortable talking about. Probably the main thing I'm associated with is actually cutlass, which is just a shorter sabre. So you'll see me put on a lot of cutlass workshops. And then at the start of every workshop, I'll be like, oh yeah, sabre and cutlass are used, I'm going to use the terms interchangeably because the technique is the same. But yeah, that's kind of my specialty. Also, for those who don't know, my name is Tim. I'm the instructory person, also convener at the Old Sword Club. So, I've been putting these on just every week to kind of make up for the fact that we can't train, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be able to train in person again soonish. And hopefully I'll get to meet a lot of you in person rather than just through my phone. So most of the focus tonight again is on the culture around dueling and also fencing in the 19th century, particularly looking at Britain and the English-speaking world. But I'm also going to look a bit at France and Germany and potentially also the United States, because the US had its own kind of weird dueling culture as well. And I think a lot of the comparison actually illuminates a lot of how European culture and society were changing in really since the Enlightenment, so since the mid 18th century, and certainly very much so in the 19th century. So I'm going to just start going through the points I have on my notepad here, physical notepad, because I am old school. But yeah, like I said, if you have any questions or is anything you want to specifically know, just post in the chat, or just post in the chat just so that I've got a chance to kind of finish my point, and then I'll get to them as quick as I can. So the first thing I kind of wanted to cover with dueling is what I'm actually talking about when I'm talking about dueling. The term duel gets applied a lot to a lot of different forms of individual combat. And I do, as much as I do think that is, that's not incorrect. That's literally what a duel is. When I'm talking about dueling in this context, I'm talking about a specific series in Europe. They originated in particularly Italy, particularly Italy, but as what I gather as well around Spain, and in the Mediterranean during the Renaissance, and then slowly sort of found their way to the rest of Europe. Certainly appearing in Britain during the age of Shakespeare, where this is a very formal kind of restraint of civilized violence, I guess. Where rather than just having it out, there is a series of formal customs and rules as a way of regulating violence. A duel is a form of, I guess, regulated violence. And certainly in the case of the Italian Renaissance, and then again in the 19th century, you actually see efforts to try and codify the practice, to codify what a duel is. So a duel is individual interpersonal violence conducted in line with regulation. So obviously in the Renaissance, duels are often done, but not always with rapiers, which are these big long things that I'm not really going to discuss tonight because I'm not very good at using those. If I was ever in an actual rapier duel, my primary strategy would be to try and turn a rapier duel into a wrestling match as quick as I could. Primarily with rapier or rapier and dagger. I suspect the dagger came in initially to stop people from doing what I would do and turn a rapier duel into a wrestling match, and then kind of started getting used as a parrying device because people were like, oh, this is a really, really cool thing to parry with. You do hear, of course, of duels with other weapons, particularly in Britain. There's reference to dueling with, I guess what we would term a broadsword, although they call them short swords in the period, because a short sword is shorter than a long sword, and a long sword is longer than a short sword. Short sword just means one-handed sword, and long sword just means two-handed sword in a period context. And then occasionally you hear also about duels with long swords, because one of the the customs that appears with dueling in the Renaissance and continues right up until the end of dueling in the 20th century was that the challenged party had the right to choose weapons. There is some nuance within that. If you have the right, if you challenge someone to a duel and they say to do it with, and they can set the conditions, but you can still decline. According to legend, I read this in one of the academic articles I think I posted to the event, although it's a bit ridiculous, so I really wanted to try and confirm it through primary sources. Otto von Bismarck, the guy who's credited as the founder of modern Germany, challenged a fellow aristocrat to a duel, and the aristocrat accepted and said that the duel would take place with sausages, where what they were going to do is there's one tainted sausage, and but they wouldn't know which one, and so they'd sit and eat sausages until someone ate the tainted sausage, at which point Bismarck declined to duel in such a manner, and the whole thing was resolved. Odd. And Matt Easton's got a video about odd dueling customs, where apparently there was a duel in the United States where the proposition was that the two gentlemen involved would fly up in hot air balloons and then fire at each other's hot air balloon with shotguns until one fell to the ground and someone died. Which, okay. There is ridiculous stuff. I think my favorite ridiculous account of a duel comes from Alfred Hutton's The Sword Through the Centuries, where a duel was apparently fought in the 17th century, where the two participants had special helmets made that had a dagger sticking out of the forehead, and they basically tried to headbutt each other to death. I've not actually confirmed whether or not this is true through primary sources, but this is something that Alfred Hutton talks about in The Sword Through the Centuries, using the phrase, and they pecked at each other like dicky birds, which I don't know. If you get a chance to read it, though, I do recommend The Sword Through the Centuries, because a lot of it is Alfred Hutton just bringing up just weird stuff that he found in his research into historical fencing. Anyway, so the duel is, by the 18th century, the duel is a very formal custom. It is a very important custom to the aristocracy. And it's one of the things that kind of distinguishes the ruling class from everyone else. So, there are a lot of cases where, or it was very common that even though dueling was illegal and you could be done for murder or manslaughter if someone was injured or died, or grievous bodily harm, and even often the practice of dueling itself was illegal, aristocrats would were very likely to get off. Like it was very much, well, like today, where, you know, for the 1%, there is one set of laws for the 1% and then another set of laws for the rest of us. But yeah, and there was actually a lot of public outcry about this in Britain, when, like, you know, if there was a high profile duel and one of the aristocrats involved, you know, was when they basically either got off or got a very, very light sentence, slap on the wrist type of thing, when their opponent died. A lot of people felt this was very, very unfair because it meant that, you know, you could basically get away with murder. So dueling in the 18th century is very much, you know, it's very much a marker of class. You know, the aristocrats duel. You know, and it's a very formal affair. So your typical kind of duel in the 18th century, and the format for it even into the 19th century, was, you know, an insult would be made. Someone would feel that either their honor or their reputation, and the two are very different, and the distinction between them is actually very, very important to how dueling changes in the 19th century. An insult would be made to either honor or reputation, and a challenge would be issued, and the person challenged, the challengee would either accept or they would retract their statement. Then a formal place and time would be arranged, and the two people would go there with their seconds, with a friend or a trusted person whose job it was basically to kind of support them through the whole process, but also to speak to their opponent's seconds and relay information. So it's almost like lawyers in a civil suit, where, you know, the lawyers go between, sort of the two parties, you know, to make sure that, to kind of negotiate what they want. And part of the role of the second was actually to try and resolve things with minimal bloodshed. And Mick's just posted in the comments a link to archive.org's copy of The Sword of the Century. So I'll try and post that in the event, because, like I said, it is a really cool read. It's really interesting, especially for the history of early HEMA. And just as a side note, many months ago we got Chris Lee to talk about French fencing in the 19th century, and I did actually use his lecture as part of my research for tonight. I rewatched it, and one of the comments he makes is that Alfred Hutton actually seems to get a lot of his ideas from French fencers who are doing basically the same thing, but started like 2 decades earlier. So yeah, just for details of that, just check out Chris Lee's lecture, and I will post that probably to the page and just everywhere, because I really enjoyed that lecture. Anyway, so you go along, you have your seconds. Often there'd be a third party, like, to supervise the duel as a whole. In a lot of cases, it would be a surgeon or a doctor. Like, you'd have someone with medical experience there on hand. And who's basically there to sort of, adjudicate the whole thing. And it was kind of the role of the seconds and the adjudicator to make sure everything was conducted properly and conducted fairly, in line with whatever code of dueling was sort of around at the time. One thing I realized researching this is a lot of people seem to be of the impression that the code duellos that were about, they're all called code duello, even though there's variations in the rules. Not huge, but like localized variations in the rules, was this official document that everyone followed. But these are much more guidebooks. It's much more of a guidebook that just was a very popular guidebook. It's not, if a duel wasn't conducted in line with the code duello, like if something that the code forbade happened and all participants in the duel, including the seconds and the adjudicator, were cool with it, nothing was going to happen. It was just going to be like, oh, they didn't follow the code. Oh, they didn't follow, what's in the book. But yeah, so dueling as a social custom has kind of two functions. It's a way of showing that you're prepared to defend something of yourself. For aristocrats, your honor. For later, for the bourgeois, particularly the bourgeoisie, when they took up dueling in the 19th century, it was about defending reputation. But it's showing that you're prepared to defend your reputation with violence. And it kind of becomes this way of, minimizing the chances of a further insult, because someone's going to be like, oh, well, if I insult this person, then I'm going to get challenged to a duel. It's also a way of sort of showing like bravery and courage, and showing like that strength of your convictions. And that's kind of its official purpose. Like its official purpose is a way of kind of, if not defending honor or reputation, or at the very least, showing that you're prepared to defend, showing that you're prepared to do it to anyone else who might, encroach upon you. The other thing it kind of functions as is like a form of sort of like a social safety valve, I guess. And this is kind of a consistent thing with dueling throughout all of history and across all cultures. Letting people basically fight in a supervised fashion that has a low chance of death basically means that when tensions boil over between individuals, they can go and kind of fight it out. The Viking Holmgang famously, you're allowed to take only 3 shields into the arena until the duel is done. And the idea being that you'd use 1 shield until it was so battered and cut to pieces that it wasn't a very good shield anymore, at which point you'd very quickly switch to another shield. To chop apart, a wood and leather shield would take a considerable amount of time and effort. So I think the idea was basically that people were hacking at their shields to exhaust each other. And you see the same thing in the duel where, very few duels in the 18th and 19th century resulted in injury or death. Very, very few resulted in death. But even of those, serious injury was uncommon, or was probably, a lot of duels were resolved before someone was actually hurt. The estimates vary. I think I've posted some of the articles I posted have estimates in them based on numbers of accounts read, but there's not consistent. It's usually usually they have around half the number of duels result in an injury of any kind, and then a very small fraction of that result in death. And so basically with a duel, what would happen is the 2 participants would go at it for a bit, they'd break off, separate, stop for a rest. In that time, the seconds would go over and start talking and try and negotiate to end hostilities, to basically provide something that would satisfy both parties. And if they couldn't, then the duel would resume. If they could, then the duel would end. One thing about pistol dueling that quite surprised me when I first read this, pistol dueling had an incredibly low injury or mortality rate. In fact, it was much lower than dueling with sword. For reference, when I talk about sword in this context, I'm specifically talking about an épée, so one of these things, although sharp. This is obviously a training one. Just because when people talk about dueling with sword, that's the sort of sword they're talking about. And épée is roughly just French for sword. When people dueled with a saber, with one of these, I'll try and refer to it as saber, although saber dueling is a lot rarer, is a lot less common than dueling with a sword, with an épée. But yeah, pistol dueling actually had a much lower mortality rate, because what would happen is shots would be fired. They'd miss, the actual accuracy rate. Pistols were notoriously inaccurate, and just with nerves and with the desire to get the shot in first, shooting as quick as you can, your accuracy goes down quite drastically. I tried a sort of similar experiment with Nerf guns, and when I'm shooting at a target with a Nerf gun, I have a reasonable degree of accuracy. But I found when shooting at a housemate, a friend, still a friend from that distance around, from the same distance, the chance, even though they're a bigger target, my accuracy went down drastically because we were both very desperately trying to shoot the other person first. But yeah, pistol duels had by some estimates only about 11% injury or death rate of injury or death. And in between, and part of that is, shots only a very small number of shots would actually hit anyone. And yeah, unless you're Alexander Hamilton. Yes, quite famously, Alexander Hamilton, American founding father, died in a duel. Yeah, in between each shot, because these pistols, these are muzzle loading pistols that take quite a long time to reload. The seconds would go over and negotiate, and I wasn't able to find out which British Prime Minister this was, but quite famously, there was a British Prime Minister who went on to be one of the architects of British Empire in the 19th century, like one of the main architects, and a very, very skilled foreign diplomat, like foreign negotiator, who got in a duel and was quite famous for being able to end it after one shot. So both participants fired. The seconds were sent over, and what he told his second to say and to negotiate was able to resolve everything very, very quickly, which is kind of, I don't know, quite poignant and quite poignant. I've actually read some letters from him to friends, and even, there's even letters he has with friends in boarding school, where he's very, very diplomatic about disagreeing over tastes in literature at the time and whatnot. But yeah, so dueling kind of was this formal, it was a very formal affair, very aristocratic, initially aristocratic and then later bourgeois affair. There are proletarian forms of dueling, most notably around the Mediterranean, in the Baratero community. So, if you get the chance to read the Manual del Baratero, which James Rand is soon releasing a translation of, talks about dueling customs within essentially these sort of nomadic communities down in Iberia. Sort of fringe groups, but in Greece, knife dueling was very, very common, and a lot of what seems to allow for dueling basically to occur is legal exemption. So if you're in Northern Europe, in Britain, France, Germany, places like that, what allows dueling to flourish is that the chances of actually there being any legal repercussions if you're an aristocrat are very minimal. So aristocrats could duel, but everyone else, not, I guess, the 99%, to use a very modern term, if they engaged in duels with weapons, would likely be arrested and jailed. In Greece, if there was a knife duel, part of it, or part of what allowed it to happen, was that there would be fairly minimal legal repercussions for dueling. In fact, going to court, standing up and basically declaring how you performed in the duel, during the court case was part of the ritual of dueling, of the dueling practice, and then receiving a slap on the wrist, in some cases even just a fine for mutilating someone, like cutting their face up. Then that was part of the custom. Cool. So I've got some comments in the chat, so I'm just going to pause before I go into it. So let's see. Yeah. So I've got a few comments about just famous people in duels. So I've got obviously Alexander Hamilton, who died in duel. Also, I've completely forgotten his name. American president Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was famous for getting in a lot of duels. And one of which where he was shot and injured, but basically stood firm and refused to move, refused to enter duel until he'd taken his shot, and then took the time he needed to kill his opponent, which he then got away with, and was obviously able to be a president. Not that committing crimes seems to stop you from being president these days, but still, he got in quite a number of duels, I think 48 all up. And so this was very much something that was, even though it was an aristocratic custom in Europe, was very much replicated in North America. Although dueling fell out of favour in the northern states about the same time as it did in Britain. In North America, dueling fell out of favour in Britain, except in the military during probably about during the early to mid 19th century, much earlier than anywhere else. But dueling was still a custom and practice in the South, which I think is a very, very interesting statement on, the South being probably a bit more hindbound, a bit more traditional, whereas the North was, much happier to kind of, was much more progressive and much more happy to sort of move with the times, I guess. So I'm going to comment. So someone said, I heard that when the duels needed to rest, they would score the ground with the tip of their sword, then they would pause to clean the sword to prevent infections. Do you know if that's true? I don't. I've never actually heard that before. It's certainly not something mentioned. Yeah, I don't know. I know that there was a lot of concern about infection. So, you know, um, one of the with the first emancipated duel. So, something I was going to touch on later, but I might as well bring up now. Is dueling became so important in continental European society that even with the sort of the social progress of the 19th century, dueling kind of stayed around and women started participating. So you have what's termed an emancipated duel, which is just a duel between two women. The first of which was a duel between two aristocratic women over flower arranging, which sounds bizarre and hilarious until you remember that, like, flower, what it actually was over a very, very important and very prestigious position and very, very important, like, social sort of political position between these two aristocratic women, one of whom was a duchess, the other was just, I think, just a miscellaneous aristocrat. But this duel became so famous and was reported through so much of Europe that it prompted a trend where women would duel in exactly the same way. And so what happened was the duel was challenged. These two women agreed to fight a duel with swords, with épées. They wanted, and they chose as their they both chose women as their seconds, and the person supervising was one of the first women surgeons, one of the first women to become a fully accredited and licensed surgeon in the area. And one of the things this woman said, the superwoman who was supervising said, was, you don't want to get dirt in the wound because that will lead to sepsis, like you get infected. And so so it was decided that the duel would happen topless. To make this any more salacious. So what happened was, these two women, their seconds were both women, and the woman who was adjudicating the whole thing, the surgeon who was adjudicating the whole thing, all went out and found a private place in a park to duel, away from prying eyes. A group of men had come with them, like coachmen and servants and stuff, who were all sent away because the women would be dueling topless. What happened was the two women dueled. One stabbed the other one managed to stab the other in the face very lightly, like give a light wound to the face and draw blood. But the duel continued, and the first one was then stabbed in the shoulder, which was a much more substantive wound. This then prompted an argument that was never resolved about who had won the duel, because whether it was the person who had got first blood or whether it was the person who had got the best wound, had managed to stab the other in the shoulder. The ensuing argument about who had then won the duel, because they all agreed that the duel was over because blood had been drawn, but they couldn't decide who had won, prompted basically a screaming match, which then prompted the men who had come along to return, because they, in inverted commas, thought that there was some distress. At which point the woman who was adjudicating saw these men returning and ran at them and attacked them with her umbrella for being perverts, for trying to come in and spy these topless aristocratic women. So it was kind of a very sensational affair, and this led to copycats. But there was a lot of concern in the 19th century, particularly after germ theory and sanitation became very, very important medical practice about infection. So it might be that it may be the case that people did put their sword in the ground, be like, oh, I have to clean my sword, we need to take a break. But I don't know. I've not really heard of that custom before. And yeah, so another question. So I've got some comments about knife dueling. People found the idea of dueling with knives really interesting. I will specify, so knife dueling Where it does happen, the knife is used because it's a weapon that you have. It's not, this is in usually a proletarian thing. This is amongst usually quite like very working class communities where people wouldn't necessarily have swords, or like be able to afford a sword or maybe even a pistol, or if they did, it was just not common enough. And something to remember at dueling is often the weapons used were determined by what was common or customary in the culture at the time. So in Britain, after really like this, I think the 1770s, 1760s, even nearly all recorded duels are done with pistol. The British would duel almost entirely with pistol. Same with the Americans. In France, it was a lot more diverse. Like in France, certainly pistol duels did happen, but the most commonly used weapon was the épée. This was considered a specific, and in the 19th century, this was considered specifically a dueling sword. Like it didn't have any other purpose other than for fighting duels. Whereas in earlier periods, its ancestor, the small sword. I say ancestor, but a small sword is just an épée with a different hilt. Like they're very similar weapons. Especially, which is interesting, especially when you consider that the rapier is kind of the ancestor of the small sword, even though it's a very, very different weapon that I can fence perfectly fine with a small sword using épée technique because it's very, very similar because weapons handle the same. Whereas when I pick up a rapier, I have very little idea what I'm doing. But yeah, sabers were also used in France as well. Like there's a lot more diversity, but knives are only ever used in duels by working class communities because people have knives with them for work. In Greece, where knife dueling was very common up until sort of the late 19th century, the people who were most feared were butchers. If you worked as a butcher, it was thought that you'd be quite dangerous in a knife duel. And I mean, there certainly are accounts of butchers who are quite famous for being very, very good at dueling with knives. Knife dueling's it's an interesting thing. Generally based on the descriptions of the duels and also of even like technical manuals we have, it's obvious that both parties are pretty keen to minimize injury or death. So they're being very, very cautious. And there's a lot of thought given to how to minimize danger to yourself when acting in the duel. So it's not like medieval knife fighting where a lot of what you're training to deal with is someone just rushing at you and trying to jam their dagger into you. You're much more concerned about cuts to the hand, or the worst actually cuts to the face, because a lot of the goal with a knife duel was to cut the other person on the face and to mutilate the face as a way of showing that they lost a duel. And like that was considered the height of humiliation, really throughout the Mediterranean, certainly in Greece, but also in the Manual del Baratero, there are comments about how a baratero who is cut along the face is considered unskilled, is considered to have done poorly in the duel because their opponent was able to get close enough to do that. Which, if you train knife, like if you really trying to minimize hits to yourself, getting a hit to the face against a competent opponent is quite difficult. You generally end up hitting to the knife, like the weapon hand, which is also why you'll notice in a lot of the workshops I've run, I emphasize attacking the weapon hand, and that's kind of an importation from studying dueling practices. But yeah, I'm mostly going to be focusing on upper class dueling here because it's one, much more documented, but two, slightly different. And what's interesting in Greece, the upper class didn't duel. They didn't duel with each other. If they were going to, the closest was that they'd have bands of like working class people that they'd send to fight an opponent's band of working class people, but they didn't duel themselves. Whereas in the rest of Europe, in like certainly northern Europe, actually around the Mediterranean as well. Like certainly dueling was very important in Italy. It was mostly the upper class who dueled. like customs, fighting customs amongst the working class from the period, dueling customs kind of filtering down, but they're not super similar. Certainly in Britain. There was a tradition of fist fighting, of getting in punch-ups amongst the working class, as there is today. And you would try and have a second. You'd try and have people, like someone with you, but it wasn't terribly important that they be someone you trusted. It was more you'd have someone else there basically to make sure that no one fought dirty. And yeah, like they would, this was meant to be a fair fight. This was also a form of public entertainment, interestingly enough. Like, two people get in a fight in a pub, and they'd fight in the middle of the pub, and everyone else in the pub would create space for them so that they could watch the fight. But yeah, so there is kind of a fighting tradition in the working class, but my reading of it is actually quite different to upper class dueling. I guess to get dramatically off topic. All right. So yeah, so I sort of commented on this before, but something I wanted to really kind of talk about in terms of like what pricked my interest when I was researching this was the way in which the change in dueling culture really showcases broader cultural changes in the 19th century. So basically in the 19th century, dueling changed quite drastically. In the 18th century, really in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, dueling is kind of similar everywhere. It's there's obviously differences, and I'll talk about those, but it's an upper class tradition. It is primarily about defending one's honor. And it is it is sort of regulated. It is a badge of, being an aristocrat. If you're a member of the petty bourgeoisie, if you are, maybe a very wealthy person, but not one who'd been born an aristocrat, not one with titles, you weren't necessarily able to duel. You potentially face much more severe legal repercussions for trying. And then as the 19th century and the rise of the bourgeoisie as the ruling class, incidentally, if I use terms or I reference bits of history that you're not familiar with, do jump in. So just as a crash course, because I don't know what you know, so if you already know this, I apologize. If you don't already know this, then hopefully it's informative. Basically, 19th century sees this massive, very considerable social change, partially as a result of a change in who is the ruling class. So from the Middle Ages onwards, the ruling class are the aristocracy. They're the landed gentry. They're people who own land, but most of their power is derived not necessarily from wealth, although they were quite wealthy often, but from ownership. So they own the land. They own the land that people worked. Up until the abolition of serfdom, they owned the people on the land as kind of a form of not quite slavery, although, in different parts of Europe that was abolished at different times over a very radically long period. So in some cases it was, during the 1300s, like in Britain, serfdom pretty much ended in the 1300s, whereas in Russia it wasn't until the reign of Catherine the Great. And then in the Industrial Revolution, you start to see a change where it's no longer people who own land. It's no longer necessarily physical, like landholders, that are the ruling class, are the wealthy. It's people who own the means of production, who own factories that generate and make things. Land becomes less important because you can produce an incredible amount in a relatively small space in a factory. Factories in this case could often be the size of a city block. There are some old factories in the middle of Sydney, like industrial era like 19th century factories that are now big apartment buildings, in the city, which are kind of cool to see. And this is what's termed the rise of the bourgeoisie. So this is when basically you get essentially modern ruling class. So the people who are in charge, they're no longer people who own large tracts of farmland. They're necessarily. They're people who own businesses, who own factories, multiple factories. So they're your Bill Gates, your Steve Jobs, your Elon Musks, as opposed to really there aren't really any famous aristocrats anymore, because there are still people who have aristocratic titles, but not many of them are that wealthy anymore. I mean, I saw there was a wonderful documentary I saw ages back about the last aristocrats in Europe, and a lot of them, the ones who are most well-to-do are people who still had their estates that they used as that they ran as a nice bed and breakfast, which did look really, really pleasant to stay in. But so with 19th century, you get this transition from the rule of aristocracy to the rule of bourgeoisie. Wealthy, factory owning and basically company owning individuals. And they start to integrate themselves into older social customs. But this also leads to a changeover in value. So for the aristocracy, honor is really, really important. Honor is, as a concept, is kind of this very essential, essentialized concept. It's very kind of catch-all. You either have honor or you don't. And so an injury to your honor is an existential threat, because if your honor is so damaged, honor, and honor is kind of, it's the mark of a gentleman, is the mark of your entrance in, or your your kind of membership of the ruling class. So having, and it's something that is performed. Instantly with the rise of modern fencing in Britain, with the Angelo School being found, the Angelo School being incredibly influential throughout the 19th century. The Angelo School was actually a school that taught aristocratic skills. It was a way of, going to the Angelo School was a way of performing your membership of the aristocracy. So you learn writing, you learn etiquette, and particularly you learn fencing. And one of the things that Henry Angelo did that was very innovative is he rebranded fencing not as a thing you would do to prepare for the duel or to train for self-defense. It was seen as kind of a bit of a vice, but rather as something that was very, very important to showing that you were a refined and a gentleman. And his fencing was initially his fencing was specifically continental foil fencing, French foil fencing. And was just initially it was distinct from the native British tradition of backsword and single stick, which, a single stick was notoriously cheap, and anyone could do it. And there's a lot of very famous sort of single stick and backswording, combatants, even people who were prize fighters, who made their living basically fighting with these weapons, doing display fights, who were essentially members of the working class. And so there's this really interesting kind of class dynamic to that I can't really go into detail on because that's getting a bit too off topic, I'm afraid. But yeah, so what the aristocracy was defending in a duel was their honor. They couldn't let an insult stand. They had to, and so in a way, the duel was it was almost like a form of, not resurrection, kind of like resurrection or purification. Your honor is damaged by an insult. Someone suggests that you're not, that you don't properly have the quality of honor. And so you perform, you have a duel, you perform this kind of ritual as a way of demonstrating that, no, I'm honorable, I am prepared to defend my honor with violence. And I engage in a duel, and a duel being something that only really the aristocracy can do. So therefore you must be a member of the aristocracy, and because the aristocracy is defined by having honor, you definitely have honor. This is kind of the custom. And it is a very essential concept. It is, probably the closest modern concept would be kind of masculinity, where masculinity is this very essential thing that is kind of performed and must be defended, and in some cases defended with violence. You ever see some dickhead pick a fight at the pub because they feel like you've insulted their masculinity somehow. You kind of you've kind of seen this thing in practice. So yeah, in the 19th century that changes with the rise of the bourgeoisie. You get, you move away from honor as a concept and dueling starts to fall out of favour. So in Britain, it outright, it falls out of favour. It falls out of favour outright. The pistol duel, like the only place dueling happens in Britain in the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, is in the military, where you'd expect people still wanting to defend their reputation through blood if necessary, or wanting to prove that they were good fighters. But what's interesting is on the continent, in France, particularly, a lot of the people most engaged in dueling are politicians and also journalists, people who are defending their reputation for blood, whose reputation is tantamount to their career, and so they're prepared to defend it through violence. And this is kind of a transition from very kind of medieval and early modern ideas of a person's place in society is essential. It is defined by their birth, to kind of more liberal, more modern, like Enlightenment era ideas of meritocracy. So with the Enlightenment, you get the notion of meritocracy, the idea that a person should, or the people who occupy a position should be the people who are best suited to it, not necessarily someone who's born into it. And this is a big thing with the French Revolution. It was a thing was a thing in Britain. I mean, probably much earlier, honestly, and this is something that seems to go hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution. The idea of meritocracy comes in, probably because there are very wealthy and now politically powerful people who weren't landed gentry. And they're like, no, I'm not powerful because of where I was born. I'm powerful because of who I am. I have merit as an individual. I was able to, I did really good at the business factory, and now I'm, top dog. And this is why, and you see this in actually the conflict between Britain and France, where with, say, the colonisation of Australia, Captain James Cook, who was sent by the British, was the son of a cobbler, but was very successful at mapping out and ultimately setting in place the colonisation of the Australian continent. La Perouse, who was French, was an aristocrat, and sure, he was the only. He was apparently a very good captain. He was the only French naval commander to actually beat the British in. To beat the British at sea in a naval engagement. Otherwise, the British Navy just dominated. But he was much later. He took a lot longer to get to Australia, and then his ship disappeared somewhere in the Pacific. Thankfully, we have a lot of his journals, a lot of his writings and stuff, and his records, because he had them copied when he encountered the Sydney colony, Arthur Phillip's Sydney colony. Is part of his journey, so we do know a reasonable amount, thankfully. Just not where his ship is. So so you get this idea of meritocracy. You get this idea that a person needs to be judged by criteria other than birth, by how good they are at a thing. And what that means is, in Britain, there's no point in defending honour, because that doesn't actually mean anything anymore. Honour is an essential characteristic that doesn't really have criteria, doesn't have any, there's not really set criteria for honour. It's a very abstract thing, and mostly symbolic. Whereas with merit is less abstract. So there's not really much, if someone insults your reputation, if someone says you don't have any honour, well, that doesn't really mean anything anymore. The exception of that being in the military, where you have to defend your reputation with violence, because your profession is dependent on your reputation for being good at violence, for being a good officer. And this is why dueling with pistols continues in the British military until much more recently. And was very important. It was also very important to show that you were prepared to face violence. This is something you'll see as a theme throughout later 19th century dueling. There's one case where two officers were drinking together. One very drunkenly insulted the other. And the insulted part, they had a bit of back and forth. And then the next morning, the insulted party actually went up and just said, oh no, so the guy who got drunk and insulted, went up and apologized to the guy he insulted, said, look, I'm sorry, I was drunk, no hard feelings. the problem was that the person who had been insulted, who was fine with the whole affair, fine with the apology, was ostracized for not challenging a duel, and eventually, which he had good reason for, because the guy who insulted him was the best marksman in the regiment. And eventually, like, people would physically not talk. Like, he'd walk into a room, people would all turn their backs to him because they thought he was a coward for not challenging to a duel. So he was eventually pressured into challenging the guy who insulted him, and then apologized without prompting the next day to a duel, at which point he was probably killed in the duel. But yeah, so basically you get this idea of where dueling becomes more about defending one's reputation. And so in France, it becomes very, very important to defend your reputation first as a professional. So if you're most of the duels were fought between either politicians, you know, where, because you think about how important reputation is to a politician even these days. Like, you know, like if there are two, you see the scandals that are happening with New South Wales state government right now. If there is enough damage done to Gladys's reputation, she will ultimately have to step down, and may already need to. Yeah. Mixes a poly with honour. Well, this is the thing. It was politicians became primary duelists, or the profession that duelled the most. Aristocrat is not a profession. It's the when it became more about less of it, when honour became quite nebulous and unimportant to duelling, and reputation was a big thing. But yeah, so the other profession that duelled a lot in France were journalists, and in fact, some newspapers would keep fencing masters on staff in case so that journalists could be trained for the duel. Like, this was quite important. But where reputation becomes important as well is not just in your reputation as a professional. So a journalist if a journalist defames someone or says something rude about someone, which journalists do all the time, they might be challenged to a duel and therefore have to fight a duel. But the other place in France and in most of Europe where reputation was important was as your reputation as a citizen of that country, or as a person of your ethnicity, in a context where states were increasingly supposedly defined by the ethnicity of the people within. So your dueling was considered very important in France, and Chris Lee's talk, which he did a few months ago, he talks a lot about this in a lot more detail. In France, dueling was seen as a quite important custom to encourage, because it was seen as showing that the French were strong and able to defend the reputation of France in the same way that they defend their personal reputation. This was a big thing. This was a big thing also in Italy. The dueling and sword fighting, fencing was very important to Italy. In fact, when the modern Italian state formed, when Italy was unified, it was quite important that their fencing be unified, and it was a big consideration as to which fencing masters would be put in charge of setting the national fencing curriculum, based on who was considered to have the most authentically Italian style of fencing. So there was initially a preference, I believe, towards more southern styles, because it was thought that the more northern styles had become too influenced by French fencing. Which is in itself kind of interesting, because that also meant that a lot of fencing masters whose styles didn't really meet national standards after unification left. And it's actually suggested with Alfred Hutton by a few of the Italian fencing practitioners I've talked to, that the Italian fencing he's referring to is not the national Italian style necessarily, because he talks about certain things being Italian that aren't necessarily in the national curriculum. Might actually be from Italian fencing masters who left with unification or the standardization of fencing. But this was a very important thing to show. It was a very important thing to show that you were prepared to defend not just the reputation of yourself, defend your person, something of your person with violence, but also defend the reputation of your country with violence. And of course, the Germans dialed that up to 11 with their dueling fraternities, with Mencia. So for those who don't know, the German Mensa academic fencing is a form of fencing done in German student fraternities. You get basically a blunt sword, and you put on goggles that protect your eyes and your nose, steel goggles. And you have this big gorget that protects your neck and armor on your body, and you have your arm locked in a single arm-long vambrace, so you can't bend your elbow. And you basically stand within distance and just wail on each other. I'm going to struggle to do this indoors, but I might try and give a demonstration. Also, if you do say something, I can't hear you until I put my earpiece back in, I'm sorry. But to get a sense, they stand basically bolt upright like this, and then they just cut at each other's face. And I'm going to need to do this with a shorter sword because they also do it in rooms with much higher ceilings than this. So just to use a buffer, you stand sort of bolt upright and you just cut at your opponent's face. And the idea is basically in doing this, you are going to get hit in the face. There is no way to not suffer, to not be struck. And then if you are struck, they would like the surgeon on hand would deliberately sew the wound up badly so that it would scar. These are blunt swords, so they're not going to kill anyone, but they are going, a good enough whack will basically rupture the skin. And it actually works better that they're blunt because when a blunt weapon breaks skin, it tends to explode it and leave a very visible scar. I don't know if you can see my scar from when I didn't have proper hand protection. Whereas a sharp sword will leave quite a smooth cut, although also probably cut someone's head off, which you don't want either. But the idea behind this was that you're actually you're showing that you're prepared to face injury and face and do injury to another person in defense of your community, in defending the honor and the reputation of your fraternity. And it's really interesting in its you're showing that you're prepared to face danger in defense of your peers. And in some ways, your peers were your fraternity and your class, and in some way, your peers were was Germany, was the German nation, and that's why certainly into the 20th century, and a lot of German conservative politicians, also high-ranking Nazis, had dueling scars because that was considered kind of a way of showing your elite status, that you were not just economically but also ideologically a member of the ruling class, which is why it's very popular with conservatives. Although interestingly enough, the people doing this were not aristocrats. The aristocracy lasted longer in Germany than it did in Britain. In fact, it's not really until the 20th century that the aristocracy completely ceases to be politically important in Germany. But the Münster academic fencing was seen as a very middle class thing. This is a way of middle class university students earning their entry into the ruling class and proving that they had the personal qualities, the merit to be a member of the ruling class. So interesting enough, dueling it sort of stayed, it stayed kind of an expression of elite status, but it also became kind of more of an expression of class mobility, where if you were prepared to duel, if you could engage in dueling, it showed that you're a member of the ruling class. Whereas earlier, if you weren't a member of the ruling class, that the chances of you being able to fight a duel without repercussions were negligible. And so I think this is a really, really interesting change, and I think it's actually really interesting in Britain, where dueling just goes away, the old aristocratic honour declines in favour of meritocratic ideas of reputation. Most of British society just says, all right, well, dueling is kind of barbaric and backwards and something that they do on the continent, except in the military. But in the military, it's understandable because defending your reputation with violence, showing that you deserve a reputation for being good at violence, is very, very important to your profession. And then on the continent, dueling goes from being a mark of aristocracy to being a way that members of the middle class, members of the bourgeoisie, can prove that they are worthy to enter into the ruling class. So yeah, so that's sort of the end of what I had to what I wanted to sort of get through. I can talk a little bit about dueling with specific weapons, like what you do, if you want to keep going. But before we go on, are there any questions? Cool. I've just gotten a comment that. Oh. Oh, I've got a comment. So just to correct, I got something wrong. Um, I'm more than happy to be corrected, but yeah, apparently Mency blades are actually sharp. They're just very, very light. The training weapons are blunt, but the ones that they use are apparently sharp, which that's kind of cool and kind of terrifying. And it's also been pointed out that there are people who still participate in Mensa, like the dueling fraternity is still around. Yeah, which is kind of cool, kind of interesting. I mean, there's still, yeah, I think there was an AMA on Reddit, like an Ask Me Anything, by a guy who was in one of the dueling fraternities, and he got asked. Most of what he got asked was about the sword fighting, which I got the impression he wasn't actually that into. He was mostly there for the camaraderie and the drinking, and that's what the student fraternity was for him. But he did get some questions about how conservative are the fraternities, which he did actually answer quite well. He got asked one of the questions: would a Muslim be allowed into the fraternity? And his reply was, "Well, we're primarily a drinking fraternity, so I don't think a Muslim would be terribly interested," which I thought was a very diplomatic answer. But yeah, that is something like the Mensa. It's still something that happens in Germany, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. So I also got a comment, although message to me rather than via Zoom, or message to me via Facebook Messenger rather than Zoom, that a lot of the supposed reason why thrusting swords became so important to duel is because the injuries were a lot light. You could deliver lighter injuries that were less likely to kill, which I don't know if there's any sources that back that up, that support that. I mean, I suspect with the rapier, the reason why it's a thrusting weapon is because the blade is so long that there is so much inertia to get it cutting. There's so much inertia to get it cutting that it delivers these very, very slow cuts. Not that you can't cut with them, just that it's not the optimal way to use it, whereas a thrust is much quicker. So I always assumed that was why dueling swords became thrust orientated, because they evolved from the rapier. But it may also be that it was to minimize injury. It might be both. I don't know. I do know with saber, one of the things that, or with saber duels, particularly in the French military, the most common injuries were cuts to the arm that disabled. And there's Hema Misfits has a wonderful blog with a translation of a series of different accounts by different surgeons about dueling in the French military. And in the section on saber dueling, one of the things he talks about is that a lot of surgeons who saw people who'd been in saber duels noted that they were mostly cut on the arms, and most of them ended up being discharged because their fighting hand was disabled. There's one surgeon who talks about how he actually had to discharge a soldier because the soldier had lost the use of his fighting arm. But then when he bumped into the soldier about 10 years later, the guy's use of the hand had fully recovered. Right, so we've got some questions or comments. I have to actually check. Some comment: in Jordan, England, there was a trend for people to people in the streets of London aspiring to portray themselves as higher class, duelling would be a good way of flushing out a fake. Deeper training wounds are more serious. Okay, I think those two comments are unrelated. Yeah, a deep thrust is quite serious, but a thrust to like the arm or to an extended target is a lot less serious than a cut to it. So yeah, 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Yeah, well, it's the thing about fencing or like dueling in Britain, like even into the like even in particularly in the Georgian period, it was done with pistol, and there was a bit of a pushback, like a decrying of this, because it was felt that firearms were too easy to use, that like brigands and highwaymen could get, if they got, could use a pistol and could be quite dangerous with one, with almost no training, whereas a sword took a lot of practice. But the reason why I think they went to pistol dueling, and this kind of plays into the comment of flushing out a fake, was because in Britain you have a working class fencing tradition. Fencing masters in Britain were considered to be members of the working class, or they weren't. Well, I mean, I guess they'd be technically considered middle class, but they were more like, but they were seen as skilled professionals rather than necessarily members of the upper class, members of the aristocracy. Whereas on the continent, being a fencing master, you were considered kind of, maybe not a high level aristocrat, but you were considered somewhat aristocratic if you were teaching fencing. And a primary form of entertainment in Britain, certainly since the age of Shakespeare, was backswording and also single stick, which are fencing traditions. And these are thought of as quite distinct from continental threat fencing, which was primarily with foil, like small swords, thrusting swords, whereas back swords and broadswords are cutting weapons. And this is something Alfred Hutton talks about in Cold Steel, in this book, where he actually says that the sabre is the most British of weapons because it is descended of the broadsword, which was the weapon of, was the weapon of the British prize fighter, of the British stage gladiator of the 16th and 17th century. Basically the precursor to like like a professional boxer, like you think about prize fighters like Jack Johnson or Jack Dempsey, or even like professionals like Conor McGregor today. And sort of the precursor to that, the people who made their living by fighting in the 16th and 17th century were backsworders, were people who fought with a cut and thrust sword. And I think that's why in Britain, the aristocracy were less keen to sword fight. They much preferred pistols because at least a pistol was expensive. Whereas, fencing with a sword still had the risk that you might, some might turn around and go, oh, well, yes, sure, you duel with a sword, but like, the average bum on the street does a bit of back swording, you're not an aristocrat. So there was like a very, very kind of class-centric thing. And interestingly, it wasn't until the first Henry Angelo and the Angelo school, that fencing became fencing was always kind of a thing that a gentleman was expected to know. Like a gentleman was expected to know how to sword fight, how to dance, how to ride. But it wasn't until Henry Angelo opened his school in London that fencing really became a core mark of an aristocrat. But it was foil fencing. It was essentially like a much more sport-orientated fencing. And the idea with Angelo's fencing was this was a leisure activity that you could do, because at the time it was only really the wealthy that could engage in leisure in more than a cursory. Like, to have leisure activities was to show that you're wealthy enough to have spare time. And if you're like, oh, check out this cool leisure activity where you can get our foils and we get our special jacket and our mask and we go and we fence. And we play this game. We play the game. We do essentially a sport with swords, with foils. That was kind of a mark of an aristocrat. But interestingly enough, one thing that people realised when the duels, because the duel declined in importance through the 19th century, although it never, on the continent, never fully went away. But when it started to become very important again, particularly in France, one thing they realised is that foil fencing wasn't actually preparing people for duels. And this is where you get people like Jules Jacob talking about what to do in a duel. And this is also where you get épée fencing. Like basically a lot of fencing masters are like, all right, we need a combat sport that is a better simulation of a duel than foil fencing. So yes, yeah, I disagree with the comment that like dueling would have been a way to prove, like to see who was real and who was a fake member of the upper class. Or sword dueling would have been. Pistol dueling, well, actually, by their own arguments, pistol dueling not so much, but and this is why I think the duel disappeared in Britain, is because when it could no longer be taken for granted that an aristocrat or that a duelist was an aristocrat, it stopped being a mark of being part of the ruling class, and so they just gave up with it. So the question, in pistol dueling, what was the standard range the opponent stood at? So it was anywhere between, in the Code Duellos and the sources we have mentioned, like the dueling guides, it's anywhere between 10 and 15 paces apart. I don't know what that is in metric. I imagine it's far enough apart that accuracy would be difficult. But yeah, it also depended on where you were in the world, exactly how far you'd stand apart. I think also depending on what was the customary dueling pistol, because in some places, gun sights were considered really poor form. Like, you know, if you wanted sights on your pistol, it showed a lack of skill and whatever else, lack of honor. In other places, they wanted only very low-powered pistols. Like there is kind of regional variation, I guess. But yeah, 10 to 15 paces apart is kind of the regular range. You don't want to stand too close. So is there any other questions while we're here? If not about dueling, about like 19th century history in general. Cool. Oh, one. So Dylan wants to know, did the advent of rifle pistols and brass cartridges change the death rate? Short answer is no, because people didn't duel with rifle pistols or brass cartridges, or very rarely. I don't know about Wild West dueling, like cowboys and stuff, but again, this is mostly about like upper class dueling, whereas cowboys were laborers. Fun fact: as much as we think of about roughly a third of cowboys in any given in every sort of given documented kind of area were black, and probably about half of them would have been Hispanic. Like, this was a very, very working class and very multicultural profession, contrary to sort of modern depictions. Most of our modern idea from cowboys actually come from a Wild West stage show rather than from like what was actually going on at the time. But yeah, so advent of rifle pistols and brass cartridges did not change the death rate because they weren't used. And I think doubly so because by the time you're getting rifle pistols, the only people dueling with pistols are in the military, and the military just banned it. Like the British military actually banned the practice of dueling. They said anyone who's caught dueling under any circumstances will be discharged. They really came down hard. So pistol dueling kind of just fell out of favour by the time rifle pistols came in. Also in America, dueling pretty much disappeared in the United States with the Civil War, and it wasn't just the North won, and dueling had fallen out of favour in the North. before the well before the Civil War, but also because there was there's this feeling that after such a horrific loss of life in the Civil War, because a huge portion of the population died, it was thought that, recklessly throwing your life away on a duel was, that was really poor judgment on your part, but also really poor judgment that you would try and kill someone else over something so petty as an insult. There wasn't really a point where rifle pistols would have been used in pistol duels. I think even actually there was an effort to create sports pistol dueling. So it was like a sport where you'd wear this big heavy leather coat and this mask with like a glass faceplate, and you'd fire wax bullets at one another. But even those were still using muzzle loading single shot pistols. And unfortunately, for better or worse, it didn't really catch on. But I don't know, like, much as I don't like the idea of like dueling life or death, I imagine that I imagine that doing like a sports dueling, like basically paintball pistol dueling, would be a lot of fun. All right, so comment. Now people are getting rude because they know there are zero consequences. I don't know. I don't know if people are any less rude now. I mean, I think it's getting weird. I mean, it is getting weird with social media where there's now a risk of being ostracized for being rude, for being insulting. I mean, yeah, I don't necessarily buy the logic that, that dueling makes for a polite society. Just like, I think it's more, I mean, you hear sort of stories about like people living in cities where they're exposed to more like living in greater population density, and they're all sort of, and they often end up, sort of insulting each other or just rubbing up each other because they're living with each other in close constant confines. But yeah, like I'd be interested to see it, to do a social history on that, to see like if people are any more rude or polite today. I think that'd be a really, really interesting sort of thing to look into, like the history of manners. Yeah, like, and also like, I don't know, like sort of ideas, and also kind of like ideas around how easily people are offended. Because I mean, and I remember like there's some really wonderful histories of like the 1960s, and like you remember like at one point, Elvis's music was scandalous because he used to shake his hips, and whereas now we think of Elvis as being like, Elvis's music is something that very tame, like something like your people in retirement homes listen to. So yeah, I don't know. Like I think I'd be really interested to actually see how easily offended people are. I know in certainly the 18th century, like before press, like the press could get really, really wild, like with its insults, and like the scandals and the accusations could get really intense, probably much more intense than anything now, even with the sort of, the rise of sort of sensationalist news. Yeah, what actually I think, like what actually stopped all of that was not dueling, was actually defamation laws. So the point where people could, where there were legal consequences for for your actions, you could be sued in court, and like have a judge say, no, that was out of line, you have to pay reparations and retract your statement. Is a lot like that really changed the way scandals expressed through newspapers, like how scandalous they could be. So yeah, I know, but I would be really interested to read a social history of manners. I think that would just be really, really cool. Cool. So give a second to type any more questions, and then yeah, we'll go from there. If there's any sort of further questions or even comments, like if people just want to, I mean, it was pointed out before that I got something wrong where I thought men's blades weren't sharp, and turns out they were. Which, like if you want to correct me, it's really, really helpful. Probably better to do it now. But yeah, certainly a helpful thing. Or, if you just disagree. Yeah, well, otherwise, just check how we're going for time. So, okay. All right, so it's almost 9:30, which was kind of the point where I wanted to have everything packed up, or at the very least be moving into discussion. I didn't really actually demonstrate very much in terms of dueling technique, I'm sorry. But, I guess if you were looking for technique, certainly we have a lot of videos. I did a workshop on dueling sword a couple of months ago, like talking about how to use one of these according to Jules Jacob, primarily, and also looking at some other sources, and also covering stuff like I also talked about saber. I didn't do a workshop on like saber dueling specifically, because I talked a lot about saber technique. But what's really, really interesting about what fencing masters say about dueling technique is that they don't, in the late 19th century, they don't think of dueling as, or like with epee, you need to play a different combat sport, because the combat sport of foil doesn't prepare you for a duel. All it really prepares you for is foil, which, foil is, the targets are so limited and the rules have such an effect on technique that, okay, yeah. But with saber and, what they say is basically the difference between what you do in the cell and what you do on the dueling field, and also what you probably do on the battlefield, is tactical. It's a decision. It's about the tactics you choose to use. And so something Jules Jacob talks about. He says, if you're in a saber duel, here's a whole bunch of techniques that you just shouldn't use, or that aren't very useful, and are a bit dangerous. He said, he talks about how you have to be much more wary of thrusts than you are in school play. Like, people are much more likely to thrust in a saber duel than they are when they're fencing the cell. He says feints are not as useful. He says feints are a lot more dangerous, so don't do them. He says mostly what you want to do is try and land the riposte, or try and attack, try and hit your opponent in the sword hand, or a sword arm, which, going by reported injuries, is probably what ended most duels, is just, quick whack to the weapon arm. And what Jules Jacob also says is basically, and this I think is really good advice, is if you don't have a direct plan, or you don't have a good judgment and control of your opponent's weapon, move to a distance where you're primarily attacking their weapon hand. And that's something I found really, really helpful, is basically redressing to be at distance to attack my opponent's weapon hand. And that's also something that I do a lot of to deal with people who do systems that weren't around that weren't practiced in the 19th century, like medieval and Renaissance systems. Cool. So I've got The Last Duel by Eric Jagger is a great book covering dueling in France in the Middle Ages. Oh, cool. I will look that up. Just in case I lose reception again. Thank you. Keep going. Despite covering despite covering rules. Cheers. Oh. Yep. Mick points out, at least the duel is one-on-one, so techniques may vary. That's a really good point, and really good point that because duels are one-on-one, there's a lot of stuff that you can very safely do, and there's a slightly different footwork to it. Whereas group combat has a very different dynamic. This is something I found when I was doing reenactment combat. Is the way you'd fight one-on-one was very very different to how you'd fight in a skirmish. Never really got to do any particularly big battles. I think the biggest I got to do was about a 10-on-10 battle, where we had some artificial rules about about needing to stay in a shield wall to stop everyone from just running around. But yeah, like even in skirmishes, it's not so much the technique is different; it's the tactic is the tactics are different. Like the things you need to do are different, and there are other considerations. But yeah, like that's something I certainly want to try more of is more kind of group combat. Instantly, if you're able to practice fencing in, or when we're able to practice fencing in, something that is a lot of fun and really good for helping people learn to be more aggressive, like when they're fencing, um, is you get two people with knives against one person with a saber. And because like the saber has such a huge reach, huge advantage over the knife as a weapon, um, the knife person don't want to fight one to one. But because there's two of them, there's kind of this maneuvering and jockeying. I found that's actually a really, really good way to, not just to teach saber fencers to be more aggressive. It also teaches them to deal with multiple opponents. Um, but it also teaches the people with the knives learn how to work together and how to maneuver. So you kind of learn some good basic tactics for multi-person combat. Cool. Actually, don't know. Are there any on the subject of multiple person combat? Is there anyone here? Anyone here of the regulars of LARP crew here, um, who've done a lot more group combat than me? Um, yes, we've got at least one. Yeah, if you want to like make some comments as well, corroborate what I'm saying or contradict it, like that's cool. Like this is. I'm happy for this to be a discussion if you prefer.
Heyo. Um, Let me just start
Oh,
my video. All right. Um, my mates are gonna hate me. I was in the middle of an online game while listening to this, and they're gonna wonder why I've gone AFK. Um, so yeah, I've just to quickly explain to everyone. I play a big battle game called Soulcraft, um, and like it's anywhere between about 100 to up to 6 to even 800 every Friday when there isn't COVID. And I've been lucky that I've been able to also even general sides of about 200 apiece. And like being able to general and lead an entire 200 person side is really wonderful.
wow, that's super cool.
Yeah, there's some of my favorite memories, and everyone thinks I'm very stressed when I do it, but I just treat it correctly. And I'm usually actually quite happy. I just look stressed. With that, there are a lot of the things which you look at, like manuals that weren't intended for dueling, definitely make a lot more sense when you have to deal with more than one person. Where manuals that are intended for dueling, you kind of need to shoehorn them in, and then you kind of get it's it's hard to use really efficient lines of defense and like only moving your hand position a very little amount when you've got to deal with multiple people in front of you or coming from angles that you can't just pivot your torso to deal with. And you get all these kind of changes in technique to cover as much as possible coming from a ginormous cone opposed to that one person in front of you. So you see some changes in techniques there as well. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah.
Some of the issues, like how some variations of broadsword and cutlass will have quite an extended or like quite an across guard that's really easy to mess with if you're really good at small sword or rapier. You kind of need those when you're dealing with just all those more likely more brute force attacks, or even like just less fidelity from the average person that you're dealing with, because you're dealing with more likely less educated in sword fighting people than not.
Wow.
Mm.
Yeah. That's very cool. Well, definitely something that we can hopefully all try post COVID.
Yeah. any queries or questions on that? I know like Hearn, Dylan Porter have all dealt with it. Dylan is one of the few people that have just run up and reminded me to keep my head on straight because he ran at me like a madman with nothing but a cape and a broadsword, and I wasn't in the mood, and he just beat the crap out of me. It was really funny. Same with Jess. Jess is one warband leader, and yeah.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I guess the question is like, how do you find footwork is different? Like in terms of, yeah,
Mm.
is that a big question or a little question?
Um, yeah, the fidelity of footwork dumps until it needs to be there. Like you spend a lot of time, if you are heavily repositioning, really structured footwork is going to be a hindrance to the overall game plan. Like if you've got a bunch of people all in an L back stance kind of thing,
Mm,
that doesn't get someone to the target fast. So sometimes you just need to charge through. Um,
mm,
and if you're really efficient at dodging people who are constantly with like weapon, all of a sudden someone with a pike makes you remember, oh, I can't just slip this bare minimum that I'm used to.
mm,
Or someone with a glaive or a halberd that's just going straight for your shins. Like you've really got to do some gross motor function
mm,
quite often. Yeah, and as Phillips just mentioned, line cohesion is massively important, right? You can leave holes in your line, but there's also, if you don't go backwards sometimes, you're just going to stand there and because you can be in a lot of people's hand distance. So you
mm,
kind of always have to make that gamble of, do I die or do I kill my friends? Or do we work together or do I
mm,
try and guide them with me as I do it? And all of a
mm,
sudden communication needs to pop up, which makes trying to do very tight structured movements
mm.
kind of difficult because you got more to worry about.
Yeah, well, I remember when I was doing Dark Ages reenactment, I was actually running a group, even though I was like woefully inexperienced.
Yeah.
For a bit of a trouble. But yeah, what I found was in a lot of cases just really, if you wanted people to do anything, like even getting people to stand in a line and move forward at an even pace was really hard.
Mm.
Like I remember once, we were doing melees in this sort of like this group of trees just that were just near where we trained. And all I did was just get the group I was with to step at an even pace,
Mm.
and because and basic and just kind of like and just give them an extra 2 seconds to basically reform if we had to walk through a tree, um, or something like that, and then the people on the other side just started backing off or breaking up and getting stabbed, and yeah, like it's just such a huge thing. And I remember actually a lot of even melees in like group comp we did in the open. If both sides were trying to maintain shield walls, the group that won was the one who did the best job of staying in a line. Um, yeah, it's like
Yeah.
yeah,
Teamwork is impeccable, and you got to think about things
mm,
like who's your anchor, like your best duelists. If someone does very well one-on-one a lot, you want them on the end of your line, never near the middle, um, because they can help make up for the lack of cohesion on the sides because they can concentrate a little better. Also, they can help destroy the other anchor a lot easier. So all of a sudden, wrapping can occur a lot sooner.
mm, okay, yeah,
Because if you've
interesting.
got your best duelist in the middle, they are probably going to get uh, overwhelmed by the fact that they're dealing with multiple people. I know a lot of people who are terrible duelists and lovely to have in the middle of a line. And I know a lot
Mm,
of people who are wonderful duelists. And if you have them in the middle of the line, they're wondering why they get hit more than usual and they get very frustrated.
yeah, yeah. Also, something Kierox pointed out as well is that battle lines would really need to be drilled to be effective. So, because I know, Mosh, you've mentioned that you've trained LARPing groups in sword technique.
Hmm.
Have you also do you drill them in like marching and formation fighting and stuff like that, or is
Some groups do it. I don't personally do it. Some groups do it because that's fun.
mm,
We are definitely, yeah, Dylan's group has, because some people find that enjoyable and some people, that's not why they go to it, which like there's a massive disparaging difference between our hobbies and real warfare of like, I come to do the things I enjoy, not I better do what I need to survive.
yeah,
I apologize for Kaya swearing in the background.
that's okay. I think
She's playing Overwatch.
is she swearing at you for being AFK?
No, no.
Yeah,
No, my other mates are doing that.
okay, fair enough. Yeah, what sort of yeah, and I guess that's a really good point. Like it's sort of it's a thing where yeah, we sort of do what we do for fun, like because it's a hobby. But people are going to do what they enjoy and just kind of roll with it when the time comes. So we're actually Dark Ages reenactment. The I was watching a mass battles at Armadale, and I was just watching the battle, so I was not in it, like just not in any state to actually participate that time. But there was one group. There was one. There was these pitched battles, and it was always the same group. It was always the same people. It was always the same people on the same sides. Like they didn't vary who was on what side at all. And they were just these big, probably 200 aside battles. But there was one side. There was one side that consistently won the entire time because they had this one group, and I knew the people. And they were all from the same group, and the same thing happened every time where this group would wield around and flank, and as soon as they did that, the people are facing just their formation just crumbled. And you could see that people knew what was happening, and you could see there were times when individuals would try and do something to counter it, but it never worked. Um, I mean, the closest was a whole bunch of people obviously had the same idea at the same time, which was to counterflank. And that slowed things down,
Mm.
but it didn't actually stop the flanking. Um, it didn't actually. It didn't actually stop the flanking. Although the best moment in although that was the same battle that had the best moment of Armadale, whereas my friend Eric, um, who was my friend Eric was in the melee, and he was just overwhelmed trying to deal with everything. Eric is very much like you say, he's a very good duelist, but he doesn't do very well in the middle of the line.
Yeah.
And so someone decided to boo hurt rush him and just like rush him and just basically shove him with their shield and knock him over. And they did it. They did it. And they ran in, they ran at Eric, they shoved Eric, at which point Eric didn't move and they went flying because Eric is just a really solid guy, and it was amazing.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
The effect of just knowing that, like, you could have a flank that would be 30 to 60 people wide, and just knowing that the corner of it has fallen will start sapping at your ability to concentrate because you know they're starting to wrap around, and then the people in front of you will always just have all of a sudden, like, whether they know that it's wrapping or not, will just be able to start landing hits and landing just a more volume of hits because you're worried about what's happening next to you and what's happening behind you. And just knowing that people may be wrapping and coming up behind you, your ability to plan and attack what's in front of you just dumps. And the effect of just shouting and yelling and just being behind a line can be almost as detrimental as walking up and killing the one person and then his friend kills you.
Yeah. Wow.
And I adore that, like, because I've
Yeah.
gotten to this like emotional stage of like I want to do as much effect on a battlefield with the least amount of cuts thrown.
Yeah.
So doing that kind of stuff is amazing. Just running around and watching it, that they know there are people that have already won, so therefore their thoughts on how to win aren't there. Their thoughts are on how to survive against a group who are there to win.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So yeah, that which I guess kind of plays plays into some comments as well about people have gotten in. I'm presuming punch ups with against multiple opponents. Not necessarily to incriminate anyone in the chat, but like they said, dealing with multiple opponents requires a very, very different mentality. So I don't know if anyone wants to actually comment, like speak to that, but I understand why someone might want to just be anonymous in the chat with it. But yeah.
Well, when you talk about reenactments, you're not talking about you're going to get hurt.
Yeah, or not deliberately.
In a real event, you're going to get hurt, and the whole mindset is totally different. And I can't find the book, but there was a fencing master who was involved in a duel, and he saw pictures of it, and he said like everything he did was the wrong technique, but it was under the pressure of real combat. Really different mindset.
Yeah.
Unless you've had that, you cannot compare. I do karate. You're sparring with swords. It's not the same as if you're not going to die.
Yeah. There's not that risk.
Totally different mindset.
Yeah. It was actually with dueling, there was in the 19th century, there was a bit of an attempt to try and get some of that. What they used to do is put poignards on the end of their training weapons. And a poignard is it's a tip with like 3 little spikes on it, so it's not going to penetrate deep enough to do any damage, but it's going to cut skin, it's going to do pain, it's going to break things in the eye, like break flesh, draw blood, that kind of thing. So it's interesting in the 19th century, there's sort of attempts to get that sense of like actual risk of injury. Actually, that's something that Jules Jacob talks about a bit, where he talks about like fencing is one of the reasons why, as far as he's concerned, fencing in a duel is very different to the cell, is just people aren't going to come forward. People are very, very cautious to come forward.
With padding, once the risk of injury is removed, people have far more bravado and you'll try things. And I accept that's athletically and it's a really good thing. But when you have the knowledge that the split second difference between you hit first or I hit first makes a difference, it's quite a different mindset. That's my only attitude to it. It's the mindset.
Yeah. Well,
particularly when you're drawing blood, people hate their own blood.
Yeah. No, I get you. No, definitely. And I mean, this is something you see a lot of manuals talk about. I mean, weirdly enough, had the opposite experience with my martial arts training, where like the few times I've gotten in scuffles with people, there's a point where I realized that, even though they might be trying, like they're mostly shoving and pushing, and if they do try to punch me, they're not actually going to do any damage. It was kind of this weird realization where I'm like, wow, I've been hit harder, and I've been hit harder in training than this person is capable of, and I just push them against the wall until I calm down. So yeah, different thing again, but yeah, no, I get where you're coming from.
I think that's where sparring has a marvelous point of keeping you calm when people come into your what would normally be outside or inside your comfort zone of distance. Which is much further in Australia than England, because I've been there.
Oh yeah.
But I just think people think that have never experienced it. There's a point where I think everyone who's in a combat sport should experience. I mean, reality of a sword fight is, you're not going to experience that. But understanding the concept of what a sword can do, or practice cutting, to see what you do, it changes your mind.
But there is a lot to be said with when your hobby, when your primary thought in life is violence. Like violence.
Yeah.
When it does really occur, I mean, it's not like it's not transferable by any means.
Oh, it is transferable. It is transferable.
Right?
But you find people that don't have the ability to transfer that. I've been doing martial arts for 45 years. I just watch people who wear the full thing, and you sit back and go, "You really shouldn't be wearing that, mate." Like, learn to take it. You've got no concept of what it's like, and you watch kids when they first spar. They get a hit,
Yeah.
go down like a bucket, and you go, mate, it didn't really hit you. You know, you've really got to have there and say. Then you realise. I just think with a duel, the concept of well, I think with a sword fight, you'd be looking at impending death.
Mm.
No one wants to meet their maker before the due day. Yeah, I mean, I would, certainly those mass battles you're talking about. I think it's great training. And how do you change that? You can't change that into real swords.
Nah.
You know, it's a ridiculous concept. But my
Yeah,
thing would
no
be
one ever forgets that by any means.
is the techniques of one-on-one versus 1v many is different. And
Yeah.
that's probably more what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
I wouldn't suggest we go to have mass battles. Well, probably would be a good seller on your neck for pay-per-view. Just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've had these. I've luckily had experiences with friends who've gone and done the really crazy, those nutcases in the middle of Germany wearing nothing but Aventails helmets and live blades.
Yeah, see.
Like those boys are duffers, and like I've gotten to train with a couple of boys who've done that, and the initial shock is really terrifying.
Yeah.
But they've done it a couple of times. They're like, oh, you just either learn to respect it or learn if you worry about it too much, you forget everything else you cared about.
I would suggest that were you to get in a real sword fight,
Yeah.
you would find that most people would be reacting far slower than what you'll be used to. So it's a transferable skill.
And
don't dispute that. And it certainly gets your mind, and it gets your mind operating to think there's more than one person, which is what you've got to do. I mean, it's as close as you can come to real combat in this day and age.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Cool. So just I had a question come through the chat. So Mosh, do you mind repeating or just maybe expanding upon a little bit what you were talking about with transferable skills and what do you mean, like what you mean by that?
Saying about being transferable. So like, yeah, there's definitely the Sal play stuff. There's the when you train, like, and even going into full contact fights, like, there's still like full contactors in competition. There's always rules. There's always these things, right? And we know this, and we know how that can change the tactics, change the tone of it, change how you approach it. And then in the real street, and when things can go wrong, as we've always heard other people talk about, and we've always had to think about as well as martial artists ourselves, there's always going to be things that change that. Like concrete hurts a lot. Telephone poles are sometimes there, metal poles, the friends. There's all these things, but still learning, even just learning the dueling stuff, even learning anything, it's still transferable, and still you can still utilize it. Like I'd rather have done all the years of Kyokushin and Tai I did, and then I had a terrible incident where I threw someone over the fence of the front of a bar, but it was their fault. It's fine, I promise. It was nicer I knew how to do a hip throw than not.
Yeah.
So like, even if your training doesn't completely replicate the real thing, blessed be everyone who never has to deal with such. It's still useful having it. It's always still useful having it. And I don't know, I think most fencing instructors have felt that through the ages of, like, even if there is some Sal play stuff in here, better you're good at the sport of playing with the sharp sticks than not.
Yeah.
Well said. Couldn't agree more.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, okay, as much as coming at someone who had the opposite experience where doing boxing, like getting hit in boxing was at times more painful and more jarring than the few actual physical altercations I've had. It is better. I think it's also a thing where like there's a lot of different cell play, recreational sport, and even melee, like fencing school melees, which they used to do a lot of, or not a lot of, but they used to happen. They're just part of a number of different contexts where you're going to try and apply this skill set. There's a thing, there's a guy named Richard Burton, although not the Richard Burton who wrote 19th century fencing manuals. So Richard Burton, was a Jeet Kune Do guy who then he was in the group. I think he was in the group that he was one of the Jeet Kune Do people who very early on just transitioned to doing what was being trained for what people were training for mixed martial arts. So Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and that sort of stuff. But what he reckons is that you can do all the scenario stuff and it's good to do and you need to learn to do it, but it's still a lot of cases the people who end up being good at that after they kind of get used to it are the people who are still good at those basic kind of grappling, kicking, punching, throwing kind of skills. Like they're still those basic skill those kind of core skills never real, they're never not. All those core skills are just really fundamental, even
once they're practiced, they're there.
Yeah. No, definitely.
We've gone down the rabbit hole.
It's been good though. It's been fun.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know, probably more things to experiment on. Part of me is always tempted to do experiments with there's a lot of different practices that were used to try and just introduce pain and fear as a bit of an element to fencing. In the 20th century, in 20th century actually, early 20th century when you still had cavalry regiments, in some places I think Hungary and whatnot, they would actually fence with what is essentially a modern modern Olympic saber, so light carriole type things. But they'd fence topless, so they'd have a glove and a mask. And if I were doing it, I'd probably want something on my neck as well. But it means that they're getting sort of whips and welts and stuff.
Single stick, going to first blood, getting cracked in the head. You can see went to first blood because if it was a tap on, if you're going to get speared through, it better be speared through the arm and speared through the middle of the body.
Yeah.
It still took some gumption to get up there.
Yeah. Actually, that's it's interesting. So one of the things that came up is when the British were occupying France after the Napoleonic Wars, there were a number of they say duels, but they were the few I've heard described were actually more just altercations between French and British officers. But one of the things that really shocked a lot of the French officers were these British officers who had much less formal fencing training than the French officers often were winning in these altercations. I'd say duels, but one of the ones I heard described was a British officer was out basically patrolling the area, or riding around the area that he was meant to be sort of controlling. And he encountered a French officer in a pub. Basically a fight broke out. Swords were drawn, and the British officer quite decisively won using his saber. But I suspect a lot of that was because the British officers, the British fencing tradition of single stick, you get a lot of bumps and bruises. I think the drawing blood thing seems to be more of a competition thing and seems to be a bit more specialized. But you read descriptions of just regular single stick before, from this, the 18th and early 19th century, before fencing masks and padded jackets became common. And people got a lot of bruises and cracked ribs and things like that just because they were fencing with sticks and, developed and they would even pray Lord spare my eyes because the worst injury you could get is to lose an eye.
Well, if Mike has done coke shit in, it's been about being punched and kicked. He's at it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, it makes a huge difference. Like just getting used to like being hit.
This sim is really dumb.
Yeah. Anyway, on the subject of being hit, it's 10 o'clock, so I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you.
So thank you to everyone who came, and
Shit. Oh, okay. Well, that was out.
hope you enjoyed it. And hopefully you'll join us next week. Next week we're going back to more traditional sort of technique things. We're going to be doing 19th century, so Victorian era longsword, which is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I'm keen on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully you'll join us for that, and
I sharpened up my long sword in the weekend, did a bit of bottle cutting, plastic bottle cutting.
I think you sent a video of that.
I put it on my put it on Instagram.
Ah, cool.
Yeah, bit fun. Got to enjoy it.
Yeah, no.
Oh, it was good.
Yeah, we can tell us about it next week.
Oh, love it. Can't wait.